Hello, welcome back to Social Data Analysis. And today we're going to talk about data literacy on the subject dichotomous thinking, a type of cognitive bias that affects how we perceive the world. This is serious and we need to know about it so we can look at the data about the world and make better decisions and judgment about it. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. This channel has a lot of fun stuff for you about data. Stay tuned and let's get into the discussion. So dichotomous thinking is a type of cognitive bias that makes us want to see everything as two groups, mostly two opposing groups. We usually don't want to think about the world in as fine details or look at the fine-grained data about the world. We want to do some simple categorization, mostly two opposing sides, and make decisions with it or go along with it. And that is dichotomous thinking. And other people call it black and white thinking. What it does is it makes you not appreciate the broad spectrum of details that exist regarding a particular phenomena. So you're just interested in rich and poor countries, or developed versus developing countries, low income versus high income countries, global north versus global south, and that is it. You're not interested in any variation between these two broad categories. But the world we live in doesn't work that way. So in this short discussion, I want to touch on developing versus developed countries as one broad example of dichotomous thinking that we have been trained to believe, and we use it a lot in academia, policy, and in our social life in general. Simply grouping countries into developed versus developing really tells us little about the world we live in. How do we make decisions with developing versus developed when we don't know the differences that exist within these countries? Let me show you an example. The graph on your screen is infant mortality data from GapMinder that shows infant mortality rates of countries in the late 20th century. What you would realize that if we use the categorization of developing versus developed countries and group the infant mortality rates of countries in developed countries versus developing countries, you realize that there are about 15 countries somewhere in the middle that are simply not represented. Are these countries developed countries? Are they developing countries? We will most likely call them developing countries when we have our day-to-day conversation in academia, policy, or in social life. But in reality, the data doesn't support this type of argument that we usually make. Fast forward to 2017, you realize that a lot of countries have moved from what we call developing countries towards developed countries in terms of infant mortality rates. A lot of countries are not there in terms of developed, but they are not developing countries, right? And it simply doesn't tell us anything when we use developed versus developing, because these countries do not fit into the developing category. So using developed versus developing doesn't really tell us anything about these countries that have improved on infant mortality rates and several other aspects of their country and have moved from developing country. We simply do not know anything, and then we still call them developing countries, developing countries. Also, we lose the fine-grained details. For example, what is the difference in terms of infant mortality rates in countries like Central African Republic versus Ghana or Egypt or Malaysia or Singapore? When we group countries into developing versus developed, we just lump up everyone together, and it tells us nothing about the differences that exist between these countries. Moving away from infant mortality rates, let's look at data on gross national income. When we usually perceive countries as developed versus developing, we think that developing countries are poor, developed countries are rich. But the data doesn't really support this. You can see that there are four categories of countries in this world: countries that are poor, that are low income countries, but there are two types of middle income countries. You can call low middle income countries and high middle income countries, and there are high income countries. Realize that there are a lot of countries in Africa that are not poor. These countries are middle income countries. And then just by saying these countries are developing countries doesn't tell you anything about the differences in terms of gross national income between the countries that are doing very well and moving towards high income countries versus countries that are still poor. Realize that there are countries in Europe that are not high income countries, but they are middle income countries. There are countries in Asia that are middle income countries and even high income countries. If I don't present data to you in terms of the fine grained aspects of gross national income, you would always perceive developing countries as quite the same, low standard of living, and things like that. But the data doesn't support this. And this is dichotomous thinking. It doesn't really give you so much to know about the world. So this is not just about infant mortality rate and gross national income, but it's almost about everything. That is how we think about the world. Just two groups, us versus them, global north versus global south, rich versus poor, and it makes us see things differently. It affects our judgment, in fact, it affects our decision making. So, what is the way forward? How can you avoid dichotomous thinking and get to appreciate the world better for its details and variation? Well, always question the data. When two categories are presented to you, developing versus developed world, ask yourself what exists in between them. Are these categories absolute, or there are fine-grained variations between countries in the data? This, I'm sure, would really help you think about the world for what it really is and help you make better decisions and judgment about the world. This is social data analysis. Please like and subscribe and also leave a comment. Let's start a discussion in the comment section. Let me know what you think. I will really appreciate that. See you in the next lesson. Bye.